right. Hi, my name is Delaney Taylor, and my presentation today is on Anne Robert Turgot. Anne Robert Turgot was born in 1927 in Paris, France, into a prominent banking family. So he was pretty average middle class, not necessarily peasant, but also not nobility. He came from a very religious family and was entered as a schoolboy into the seminary of the Saint-Sulpice, which was an education program mostly focused on religious teachings. He was described as an intelligent and precocious student, so he was very advanced for his age and yet still slightly mischievous. So you can see here, look at behind his eyes, he's got that mischievous twinkle. However, he eventually rejected the traditional religion that his family had claimed and which he had learned, and he claimed traditionalism as his religion, which was very common of the era for the Enlightenment ideas. He also associated with many philosophers. He had many philosopher friends, which explains a lot of his later career choices and reforms. As a career, he was mostly a bureaucrat. He dealt with a lot of investment and financial decisions. In the 1760s, he was the main tax collector for Limoges, which is a town about 3 hours from Paris, France. This exposed him to the corruption of France's taxation. And so, for reference, French Revolution was about 30 years after when he was in Limoges. And so it hadn't gotten quite to chopping off people's heads yet because of the taxation and the money problems, but it was still very, very bad. So the nobility would relentlessly tax the peasants and kind of take them for everything that they had so they could throw all these extravagant balls and galas, which was really hard for the time because there were many famines, many struggles, and at the same time, getting ahead of myself, in 1774, Louis XVI hired him as the finance manager and comptroller general for the crown. And so he had to deal with the extreme money hemorrhage that was coming from the palace and all the nobility that was just spending the money relentlessly that they couldn't afford to spend. In 1776, that was the American Revolution. We all know about that. France's involvement in that was kind of what saved our butts back in the day. However, Anne Robert Turgot strongly opposed the American Revolution, and kind of that was the right decision because France couldn't afford to help us in the war, and yet they still did. They sent us all the money because they were our allies, and then when it turned to the French Revolution, everyone was destitute and they couldn't support the war finance, and America certainly didn't help. He was also forced into resignation by embittered nobles at the end of his career, obviously, because he proposed many reforms about noble kind of privileges being reined in or tamped out entirely. He thought that the nobles had far too much freedom, which I will get to on my next slide. Excuse me, still recovering from COVID, so I apologize for the voice. So why is he important? Why is this handsome devil on the left being talked about? He published many works on financial reform. He discussed the importance of the distribution of wealth, which was something that France greatly needed in that time period. Instead of keeping everything all in the top nobility and royals, he said that it should be spread evenly to ensure that everyone can eat and survive. Once again, this was right before the French Revolution, and so I'm sure that he felt a little validated and vindicated when people's heads started to roll. He also published letters on the freedom of grain trade. He was very into free trade and free market grain. This was one of the main issues of the French Revolution, was that they didn't have enough grain because there was lots of famine at the time. There was kind of grain plagues and people didn't have enough to eat. That's where the famous saying, "Let them not eat bread, let them eat cake," comes from. And so he proposed a freedom of grain trade. He tried his best. He attempted many tax reforms. He had the best interests in his mind for the most part. He did, introduce community service in his earlier career as part of taxation. So if lower class people couldn't necessarily pay their exorbitant taxes, they could partake in community service. So that would be like land repairs and basically like labor, kind of indentured servitude, as a form of their taxation because they didn't have the money, they could use their labor. He also created a land register in order to kind of categorize and denote who owned what land and how it could best be kind of puzzled out, so that each person, each group, community could be better off for that. Like I mentioned earlier, he combated against the famine of 1770 to 71, talking about the free grain trade. It was really a desperate and dissolute times for the people. And he tried his best to introduce different options and possibilities of things that they could do. And yet most of his proposals were rejected. He proposed, I keep saying that, he proposed 6 edicts on reform that made him highly disliked. The first 5 were pretty chill. No one seemed to mind too much, but his 6th edict, which I've talked about before, hindered the elites' privileges and rights that they thought that they deserved. So he would make them more accountable and have less sway and money coming in and have to share the wealth a little bit. It also didn't help that he was kind of an awkward guy. He had an unlikable personality. Many of the articles that I read described him as shy and maybe not the most sociable kind of guy. So that probably didn't help when he was trying to preach his reforms and get himself heard. So he faced many oppositions, like I've mentioned. He was under King Louis XVI, which he is notorious for being an unruly and immature king, spending lots of his money, not really caring about his people, kind of only caring about himself, which, to be fair, he did have to follow Louis XIV and 15th, but Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, big guy, impressive. Louis XVI, not so much. And so that was and Robert Turgot's boss, and he had to basically do whatever the king said, even if he himself thought that it was probably, and really was, a stupid idea. Marie Antoinette, the king's wife, was very extravagant, and she hated him for the reasons I've talked about before. He said that the nobles and that the rich and royals should have their wealth kind of taken away from them, not in so many words. And she was one who was notorious for being exorbitant and spending all that money on lavish affairs. And so she really didn't like him. There's also the entitled nobility, but in addition, the haughty rebellious following. So the church really didn't like him because he rejected all of those years ago traditional religious ways of life. He claimed deism, and they thought that that was a bad idea and stupid and not religiously sound. And so he was rejected by them as well. There were also many conspiracies surrounding him. They thought at some point he had conspired against the queen, so Marie Antoinette, to have her, I don't know, reputation tarnished or to have her killed. It's all speculation. There's not really any proof of that, but, you know, rumors travel fast. And so it's essentially like a Twitter conspiracy. He was canceled and kind of shunted to resignation. He had his name tarnished. Poor guy. Look at him. He looks so sad. And he kind of died in obscurity. So even though he had really good ideas and had really kind of forward-thinking reforms that might have helped France in this really troublesome time, because of the culture and because of the nobility's grasp on society, he really was silenced. And so unfortunately, he was not able to have his voices heard. And I thought, you know, I'd never heard about him before this presentation, and then learning about him was very interesting because knowing that the French Revolution was mostly a money war and a class war, and hearing that there were some people that tried their darndest to get the king and the queen and the nobles to listen to the voices of the people and hear what they're saying. And he proposed many different ideas that could have worked if they were implemented, and yet they were too arrogant to notice. So Instead, excuse me, instead of possibly a prosperous incline for France, it was a strong decline down to the guillotine. So, very unfortunate. And then my sources are listed here. Honestly, it was kind of hard to find a lot on him. I think because he was so, battered at the end of his career and shunted into obscurity. But these are the sources that I was able to find and learn about the great and Robert Jacques Turgot.